All right. So last week we discussed Samson and the account with Delilah. We have all but finished chapter 16, and so we're going to move on to the questions after we complete this. So we discussed last week how the fact that Samson was betrayed by Delilah, how that he was without his strength because he told her how he could be taken and arrested and so forth, and she had somebody come and shave his head. He expected to be able to get out of it like he had always done, but he wasn't able to. And so, as we noted, verse 23, how the Philistines have gathered, there's thousands of them together. They are celebrating the victory of Dagon, their fish god, over Samson. And they brought Samson out in verse 25 to perform for them. And in verse 26, Samson, he wants to just kind of rest on the pillars. Apparently these pillars are crucial pillars in this construction of this arena or whatever it is that he's in at this point. And in verse 27, the temple, it's called a temple, was full of men and women, and the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof, watching while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my two eyes. And Samson took hold of the two middle pillars which supported the temple. He braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. And his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. And that is the account of Samson. At the very end, as he dies, he asks, let me die with them. And of course, the 3,000 plus that were there, he killed more in that one event than he'd killed his entire life. We know that he killed 1,000 at one time with the jawbone of a donkey, and there were a bunch of others that he killed as well, but apparently not 3,000. And so for the 20 years that he judged Israel, he brought about the plan of God of bringing judgment on the Philistines. Thoughts or comments through verse 31? All right, let's look at our questions real quick for Samson, because this is where we're gonna talk a little bit more about some of these. We already discussed question 1 about his birth being miraculous. We discussed question 2. Question 3: Is there anything wrong with Samson's prayer to God in verse 28? Why or why not? Is there anything explicitly wrong? Let's put it that way. Is there anything explicitly wrong with what he prayed for? Not really. I mean, he asked for strength. He acknowledged God was the one that gave him his strength. Whether it was sinful or wrong for him to ask for vengeance for his two eyes, it doesn't appear to be so. Maybe it was, and it's just not mentioned or it's not recorded. Or God did, he did permit Samson to have that vengeance. So maybe not explicitly. We might hope that if we were in that position, maybe we wouldn't ask for that. Maybe we would ask, let me take vengeance on them for worshiping their god Dagon and promoting him as if he had overcome you through me. But I wouldn't say there's anything explicitly wrong with his prayer, simply because he wanted vengeance for his two eyes. Okay. Of course, God says, vengeance is mine. I will repay. But God, ironically, was using Samson to bring vengeance on the Philistines for hurting the Israelites. So, again, I wouldn't say there was anything explicitly wrong, just that maybe you or I, hopefully, our care and concern will be more to the glory of God and not our two eyes. Thoughts through question 3? Question 4. Why didn't Samson figure out that Delilah was playing him after 3 attempts to capture him? Have you seen that emoji that they do online? Sometimes it's like that. Okay, you kind of almost can put that there. It's one of those things where it's like I don't know. There's you can speculate. Did he know the whole time that she was playing him, but he just expected that he would, God wouldn't allow him to fall into the hands of the Philistines? Maybe. Did he expect that when push came to shove, Delilah really wouldn't betray him when he poured out his heart to her? Maybe. It's one of those things that again, it's not explained to us what was in Samson's mind. It's just explained to us what the event was. And in the end, we don't know what Samson was thinking during that period of time. And maybe he wasn't. Maybe he wasn't thinking. Sometimes, guys just don't think. And that might be Samson here. Anything else for question 4? Question 5. What attributes should we want to, let's start with, what attributes would we want to imitate from Samson? Let's start with that one. What about Samson would we or should we seek to imitate? And you can't say his strength. Say what? Okay, being true to God, recognizing that God was the one that gave him his strength. Recognize, of course, he prayed twice to Jehovah, or at least that we have a record of. And in both times, he recognized that Jehovah was the one that gave him his strength and gave him the deliverance and so forth. So certainly being true to God in the sense of acknowledging Jehovah would be one thing. What else? Standing up to God's enemies. Okay. Certainly, we would hope that standing up to God's enemies for the fact that we're standing for the truth would be our motivation. Samson's motivation is, you're not really sure what his motivation is some of the time. Sometimes it seems like it may be, for the good of Israel. Sometimes it's for himself. We're not really sure exactly what some of his motivation was, but standing up to God's enemies, not necessarily physically in that sense of fighting them, but in the sense of standing up for the truth certainly would be a part of that. Yeah. You could also include, although again this kind of comes with an asterisk, he was fearless. Okay, he was not afraid of anyone. Now granted, a lot of that had to do because of his strength, and perhaps some of it had to do with the fact that in his mind he was the chosen one of God. God wouldn't let anything bad happen to him. But regardless, at the end of his life, did Samson blame God for him losing his strength? Did he seek vengeance against Jehovah? No, it was against the Philistines. Okay, so he was fearless, and that fearlessness, again, regardless of the source, we're told throughout both, from David, what can man do to me? There's, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, all those who desire to live godly will suffer persecution. So being fearless, at least to the extent of not being afraid to stand for the truth. Does that mean that we're not anxious? Jesus was anxious in the Garden of Gethsemane, wasn't he? I wouldn't say he was fearful, but he was anxious. And certainly that certainly is a part of the human experience, is being anxious over maybe something that we have to deal with, but not being so afraid that we're not willing to do what God wants us to do. What should we not seek to imitate? What were some of Samson's weaknesses? Huh? Women was definitely one of his weaknesses. Okay, and no matter how you go about it, no matter how you may try to look at the best regarding Samson, no Israelite was ever to go to a harlot, and we see that at the beginning of chapter 16. He had issues with the Philistine woman, and he really shouldn't have been marrying someone outside of Israel, but he did. Then Delilah, who wasn't trustworthy, wouldn't seem to start with. She didn't love him, it doesn't seem, at all. He claimed to. But there certainly seemed to have been, whether you want to call it lust or sucker for a pretty face, however you want to say that, he was easily influenced by women. Okay, and that was an issue that he dealt with in his life.
It's kind of impulsive, I think, to a bad degree.
Yeah.
I mean, not just with women, but he got upset and wanted to tie these foxes' tails and burn everything down and let the chips fall.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The impulsivity, okay, that's a word, right? Impulsivity, sounds good. Impulsivity of Samson to just kind of allow his emotions to get the better of him. Now, having said that, did all of that lead to doing what God ultimately wanted done against the Philistines? Yes, it did. But that doesn't mean that God wants us to be impulsive in a negative way or to be womanizers or anything like that. So just because God knew the character of Samson and how he was going to react doesn't mean that God approved of what Samson did all the time. Now, that being the case, just as Lisa mentioned, the idea of being impulsive, allowing his anger to get the better of him, allowing himself to kind of get drawn into things that maybe he shouldn't have done, having that bet regarding the riddle, and then he went and killed 30 people to pay his bet. I mean, it's things like that that you wouldn't associate with a person that should be seeking to serve God. Okay. Anything else about Samson?
From the beginning, you can't overlook he's in Hebrews 11, one of those. He wasn't a perfect character, but what you can do by faith, as with any of them in the list, he's an example of that. He sees himself as an avenger several times throughout. He ends up being the sacrifice, at the end here in chapter 16. A number of dichotomies, I guess you'd say, about him. But I think that would be any of us, any person who dig into their life. And also cause him to serve in a position of leadership. It doesn't go into it.
Right.
As it's mentioned,
20 years.
He judged 20 years.
Yeah.
I mean, God put him in that position. He still had failures as an individual, but we all do, but he still served in that capacity as God. We don't know how God requested or told him or commanded, whatever, but he's willing and did that.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else to question 5? Question 6. What is at least one lesson we gain from the account of Samson? One lesson. Just one. I mean, there's not that there's only one, but
God carries out his plans. Sometimes we don't understand the hows, the whats, the ifs, the things behind the scene, or what does appear to us, maybe we don't see what's going on behind.
okay. God carries out his plans, and if let's kind of just move Samson aside for a minute, because I'm not saying he was evil or not evil, or sinful or not sinful, but can God use even the worst people to bring about his will? He has done so, right? And if God does that excuse that individual for doing things that are wrong? Okay, this is the argument, or the hypothetical argument Paul deals with in the book of Romans about the Jews. Well, our disbelief has brought about this grace and this salvation, so why does God blame us for our disbelief? It's unfair, it's unjust that he should hold this against us when he planned for us to do this all along. And Paul says, no, that's not how that works. You had a choice to do right or wrong. You chose to do wrong, and God, simply knowing what you were going to choose, utilized his plan through your decisions, through your choices. And I think that's an example here about Samson. Again, I'm not the judge. I don't know where Samson's going to end up at Judgment Day. Again, for 20 years, he judged Israel, as Nolan mentioned. He is mentioned in the chapter of faith of Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. So, were there times where Samson was penitent? Were there times where Samson asked forgiveness, offered sacrifices? I don't know. It doesn't record any of that regarding sacrifices or anything else. But we do see that he does have shortcomings, and generally, those people of faith, they needed to seek to correct those shortcomings and offer sacrifices under the old law and so forth. But no matter how you slice it, God used both the good and the bad from Samson to bring about his will and his judgment on the Philistines. And I think that's a very important point that we need to remember, because sometimes people can have the opinion that if I do evil, God is going to bring about or do things that are sinful. Let's put it in things that are sinful. Okay, evil is sinful, sinful is evil. But if I do things that are sinful, God's still going to bring about his will. So if God's going to utilize me by doing things that are sinful, then that should justify me, because God wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't been sinful. And as we said, that's the very argument that the Jews hypothetically make in Romans, that Paul kind of nips in the bud. He says, no, that's not how that works. God knows what's going to happen. He's going to make sure his plan comes about regardless of the decisions of man. But he still allows man free will and free choice. And if you do something that is wrong, we will each give an account of the things that we have done. And that you can't just claim, well, God, I helped your plan come about because I did sin. That's not how that works. Nolan?
It goes not only individually, but on a much larger scale. When God brings the Israelites into the land of Canaan, he said, you're driving out people who are wicked and done all these bad things. But don't think it's because you're perfect and great. And from the beginning, he warns, here's what you're like, and here's what you're going to do down the road. They're going to have their own problems, but he still used them to carry that out.
Right. Right. To bring about his will, you can't just claim that, well, we're okay. That's not how that works. And to me, the lesson of Samson is, again, there's a whole lot we don't know. There's a whole lot there that in terms of those 20 years, we're only given a brief snippet of some of that. And so there may have been times where Samson was humble, where Samson was acknowledging his faults, where maybe he offered sacrifices. You know, there's a lot of that we don't know. But what we do know, what we do see, there's some activities and thought processes maybe we should want to avoid. Now, having said that, go into question 7. Given Samson's questionable character, why is he listed in the chapter Faith in Hebrews chapter 11? On down where the Hebrew writer, he goes on to say, time would fail me to talk of this and of that and so forth. He mentions Samson in this. He says, time would fail me to talk of Gideon and of Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Why is Samson listed in the chapter of Faith? Yes.
Same question would be asked of anybody in the chapter then, because we go back to Noah. Genesis tells us some of his shortcomings. Abraham, there's times he lied and did things. I mean, right down the line, being in this chapter doesn't mean that was a perfect individual, but by faith, here's what he or she accomplished to serve God. When they remembered their faith, acted by faith, as opposed to other times in life when he or she did not.
Right.
By faith.
David is another example. Moses. Okay, every single one of these, there's not a single person on here that is perfect. They do seek to serve God in all things. Okay, but none of them were perfect. Now, having said that, there are 2 occasions where, at least in the record that we have of Samson, there are 2 specific occasions where we see Samson specifically acknowledge God's role in the things that Samson is doing. Again, those 2 prayers that we have recorded. Okay, he acknowledged the victory over the Philistines by killing 1,000 of them. And he says, you have delivered this, or brought about this great deliverance through the hand of your servant. Okay, which means that, at least in that moment, Samson acknowledged himself as a servant of Jehovah. And then at the end of his life, he acknowledged that it was Jehovah who gave him his strength. Let me take them down with me. Now, in both cases, did it require faith from Samson to make that request of Jehovah? I mean, I don't know what Samson thought God was going to do when he prayed about being thirsty. But did Samson believe that God was capable of taking care of this great thirst that he had? Yeah. And, miraculous, I'd call it a miracle. He brought water coming up, and it revived Samson. Did Samson believe God capable of giving him his strength back, even if his hair wasn't back to the full length that maybe it needed to be or whatnot? Did he believe God could give him that strength? Yeah. And let's say for a moment that Samson did have it in his head that he was the chosen one, which he was in a lot of ways. He was chosen by God to bring judgment on the Philistines. His birth was miraculous. It involved miraculous events, we'll put it that way. Not like necessarily Jesus' birth being miraculous. But that being the case, did it require faith that Jehovah would bring about his will through him? Yeah. Yeah, it did. Now, again, we can question his motivation. We can question whether or not he was properly humble all the time, or his actions and so forth. But in the end, did he have faith, and did that faith bring about actions from him that then furthered the will of God? Yes, it did. And as Nolan mentioned, that's kind of what Hebrews 11 is about, is showing that by faith, regardless of imperfect people, individuals who put their trust and their faith in Jehovah were not let down. And that's really that's the broader context of Hebrews chapter 11, is that people of faith who put their trust in Jehovah and obey, they will not be disappointed. They will not be let down by Jehovah. Does that mean their lives are going to be perfect? No. But that goes back to showing that Samson didn't blame Jehovah for delivering him into the hands of the Philistines. He blamed the Philistines. And maybe he even reflected that, I probably should have told Delilah how to cut my hair. But the fact of the matter was, he didn't blame Jehovah. That being said, the Hebrew writer goes on to describe in verse 35, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they may obtain a better resurrection. Others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, of chains and imprisonment. Samson would qualify under that as well. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword. So you have this great contrast between verse 33 and 34 of these great things that happened through faith versus some of these terrible things that these individuals endured because of their faith. But did they endure them anyway? Yeah, they did. And we have no idea, we have no way of knowing how long Samson was being tortured or in chains and being utilized to, I forget what they said back in Judges 16, that he was running the grinder, I think is what they called it. Don't know how long he was doing that. But regardless, certainly Samson's trust in Jehovah is seen in his life. Yes, sir?
He was also a Nazarite.
Yeah?
All indications, that's not an easy thing to do.
Right.
And live by. He was able to do that.
And as far as we know, we don't read of him drinking alcohol or anything like that. So that's a good point. And he was a Nazarite, and there are fairly restrictive components to that Nazarite vow that you have to be careful about. And so, yeah, that's a good point. That Nazarite vow was one, and certainly Nazarite vow had its associations with Jehovah. Not that God commanded everybody to be a Nazarite, but people took on that vow to help them in their service to Jehovah. And of course, that was part of what the angels told Manoah and his wife about what Samson was going to be. He won't allow alcohol to touch his lips and so forth. And so certainly there had to be some self-control there on Samson's part. He didn't just shirk all of it, it didn't seem. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Let's move on to Esther and Mordecai. So with the situation with Samson, we had 4 chapters, 13, 14, 15, 16, that were all dedicated to Samson. Okay, and some of those events were it just kind of boggled the mind, and in order to really appreciate a lot of that stuff, you kind of had to read through all of it in the context. With Esther and Mordecai, I would love to spend the next 4 or 5 weeks talking about the book of Esther. but we're not going to be able to read through the entire book of Esther. So we're going to focus just on Esther and Mordecai and their relationship and how these two help bring about the deliverance of Israel, or of Judah, as they're in Babylon. All right, let's go to Esther. So, got to sing my little song to myself, Esther Job song. All right, starting in chapter 1 and in verse 1, we see Queen Vashti, or Vashti, however you want to pronounce it. This is King Ahasuerus. Queen Vashti, or Vashti, there's things that she's not willing to do, and as a result, the king ends up having to seek for a new queen. He makes this feast. He calls out Vashti in verse 5, or verse, he talks about the feast, and then in verse, verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for all the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, these guys, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. And Queen Vashti, I'm going to call her Vashti. Vashti sounds weird. Queen Vashti says, I'm not doing that. And it is notable that it's recorded that the king is drunk. Okay, so it sounds like this wouldn't necessarily be something he would ordinarily do, but because he's drunk, let me show off my pretty wife to you people. And she says, nope, I'm not doing that. The king was furious. We find in verse 12, his anger burned within him. And this is when he says, all right, time for a new queen. So in verse 16, Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, for the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. When they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. And so we see verse 19, if it pleases the king, let the royal decree go out from him, let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus. Let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. And so this sets up kind of a, it's not really, I wouldn't call it a pageant or anything like that, but this decree goes out, and all of the available women of the kingdom are brought in for the king to choose. So we find in verse 4, then let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So, what was the blood relationship between Mordecai and Esther? They were cousins. A lot of times we think of Mordecai as her uncle. And he served in that relationship's uncle/father, I guess you could say. But in terms of blood relation, they were cousins. Now, presumably, Mordecai's, his uncle's daughter. So presumably his uncle and them were fairly younger, on the younger side, which would, theoretically place Esther at a young age when they died. And so Mordecai takes her as his own, basically. So in verse 8, it was when the king's command and decree were heard, many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken up to the king's palace, into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came in to go to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned: 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. So, a year of preparation, and now she's ready. But notice, how did she end up getting more than her allotted allowance? How did that happen? Sorry? Okay, Haggai, the guy who was in charge of these women, he liked her apparently the most. Okay, so he gave her extra of the bottles of myrrh, I guess, and the perfumes, gave her extra of this, these beautifying substances than what everybody else got. Now, that's not to say that that's why she was more beautiful than the rest of them, but it goes to show that because she obtained his favor, that being the case, surely, I mean, out of all of the kingdom, okay, there had to be a bunch of beautiful women there. What might have made Esther stand out from the rest of them? Blonde hair, blue eye. Yeah, absolutely, I agree, yeah.
Wasn't she Jewish?
She was,
The other ones were not.
okay, so she was Jewish.
With their facial appearance.
I mean, she may have been a little bit more exotic, I guess you could say, in comparison to the rest of them. That could be. Apparently, it wasn't so much obvious that it was obvious she was a Jew. Like it must not have been that obvious, because the fact that she is a Jew, but nobody knows that, plays a prominent role going forward. But the fact that maybe she does look a little different than the rest of them may play a role in it. What else?
I always thought after a year of spa treatments, I'm feeling happy.
Yeah. Well, what about her character? Even though that's not mentioned in here, the fact that she is a Jew, okay, and she has faith in Jehovah, and her personality would reflect that, and her humble upbringings. Okay, now granted, that's not to say all these other girls weren't humble in their own way, but we're not told that any of these other girls were Jews. Now maybe some of them were, but maybe her character or her personality stood out as well. Because not only was she beautiful, but because of her upbringing, maybe she acted differently than everybody else. Maybe she presented herself in a different way than everybody else did. Not being of that culture and being raised as a Jew, being a Jew, maybe that stood out in some way. And maybe it wasn't obvious. Again, maybe it wasn't something that was just striking, but it was enough that Haggai really liked Esther over all of the others. And we're not told how many of these other women, I mean, we don't know how many there were total, but there had to be a bunch. And Esther stood out of all of them. Now, having said that, in the end, what can we chalk up her standing out to Haggai? To whom can we give credit for that ultimately? God, okay? Whatever it was that made her stand out to Haggai, one of the things that kind of the unwritten or the unspoken term throughout the book of Esther is providence. There's not one place in the book of Esther where a miracle, and when I say miracle, I mean a obvious, observable suspension of natural law. There is no place in Esther where a miracle is found. And yet, there are all these just so happened events. It just so happened that Esther was of the age. It just so happened she caught Haggai's eye for whatever reason. And it just so happened that she was in this place in this moment in time. So providence played a major role in all of this. So regardless of what it was about her that caught Haggai's eye, in the end, God certainly was involved in it. Thus prepared, verse 13, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women. to the custody of this dude, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. What quality would you say, or maybe there's a couple qualities, would you say can we find or see evidence of in Esther in taking nothing but what Hegai suggested?
She showed a little bit of respect, but she didn't want to take what wasn't needed.
Respect. Okay, she respected Hagai's experience. She respected Hagai's knowledge of the king, maybe. What other, and part of that respect, what other quality or characteristic would be a part of that? Humility. Okay. I'm not going to do what I want. I'm going to do what Hegai thinks I should do because he's the one in charge and he knows better than I do what the best thing to do here is. And she's young. Okay. I don't know how young, but she's not like, it's not like she's 30 or 40 years old, I don't think. And as a result, this is coming from a young person. Respect, humility, what other characteristic might you see here? They're all kind of interconnected.
She had some consideration.
Okay, consideration, or you might also say wisdom. Okay, wisdom. In being able to consider what should I take with me, I'll count on the person who I trust and who knows the king and knows what would be best to take. And it says, Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. Again, was it just her beauty? Was it the way she carried herself? How she presented herself, her bearing? Maybe a little bit or a combination of all of them. But regardless, she found favor in the sight of everyone who saw her. So verse 16, Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all of his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. This being the case, what was the other name that Esther is referred to? Hadassah. Okay, Hadassah. The fact that the king proclaimed the feast of Esther suggests which name is for which culture. Hadassah would be probably which name? Her Jewish name. And then Esther would probably be her Babylonian name. Okay, we see the same thing happening like with Paul, Saul. Okay, he didn't change his name. Saul was his Jewish name, Paul was his Roman name. And this happens several times actually, several different references. Peter also went by what name? Cephas. Okay, Cephas. So we have this. This is not a new thing. Hadassah. And in fact, there's a couple other times in the Old Testament where this happens as well. But Hadassah would be her Jewish name. It would seem Esther would be her Babylonian name. And so he makes this feast of Esther. We see in verse 19, Mordecai sat within the king's gate when the virgins were gathered together a second time. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai, as when she was brought up by him. So what other characteristic do we see from Esther? Just kind of in passing that the record gives us. Obedience. Okay, submissiveness and obedience. She was submissive to Mordecai when she was growing up. She remains submissive to the commandment of Mordecai, even now that she's the queen. Okay, says the queen of Babylon, and yet she still obeys the commandment of Mordecai. All right, we will continue further here in chapter 2. We'll finish up chapter 2. We're almost done here next week, and then we'll move quickly through some of the events of chapter 3 and chapter 4 and so forth. I'm going to try not to get bogged down in the book of Esther, but there is some of it that, in order to explain it properly, some of it you just got to kind of read through and see what's happening. So we'll try to quickly move through Esther and Mordecai next week. All right, everybody, thank you. Appreciate it.